Imagine a legal marketplace where a healthy white infant costs $50,000, but a black infant is offered at a steep discount.
Right, sometimes as low as $4,000.
Yeah. Now imagine that this specific market operates almost entirely tax-free, and it's heavily subsidized by the federal government.
All under the untouchable banner of humanitarian charity.
Exactly. And look, if you're listening to this right now and you know someone who adopted a child, or maybe you are an adoptive parent yourself, you might be feeling like an immediate, intense wave of defensiveness.
Which is a completely natural reaction.
Totally. You might be thinking, wait a minute, my family isn't a market. We love our child. We didn't do this for money. And that emotional reaction is completely valid. Individual families are built on genuine love.
I mean, no one is debating the individual care.
Right. But today, we are asking you to separate the individual love of a parent from the systemic, mechanical design of a $31 billion industry.
Because when you look at the source material we are unpacking today, a deeply, deeply unsettling picture emerges.
It really does. We are looking at a system that functions less like a charitable endeavor and much more like, well, a market protectionist syndicate.
Yeah, one that utilizes literal cult-like psychological tactics.
Yeah.
Just to protect its highly lucrative supply chain.
It's wild. So let's dive into the sources we have for this deep dive.
We have a really comprehensive stack today. We're pulling from rigorous legal reviews from the Colorado Law Scholarly Commons, institutional forensic risk assessments of major adoption lobbying groups.
And some intense historical documentation too, right?
Yes, specifically regarding the baby scoop era. Plus, we have complex sociological papers from the journal M at N at Adjacent that analyze coercive persuasion.
But anchoring all of this academic data are the raw, unfiltered, lived experiences of adoptees and birth parents.
Right, pulled directly from massive threads on Reddit.
So our mission today is to help you strip away what academics term the hegemonic narrative of adoption.
Which is basically that pervasive cultural fairy tale that frames family separation exclusively as a flawless rescue mission.
Right, a simple win-win. We are going to map out the systemic architecture of this industry. We'll explore how it actively silences dissent from the very people it claims to help.
How it enforces strict psychological conformity, yeah.
And how it legally and financially prioritizes an infant supply chain over the preservation of biological families.
But before we get into the psychology and the money, we need to lay down a really clear disclaimer.
Yes, definitely. So I need to be very clear with you all listening. Some of the legal reviews and assessments in our source deck analyze highly charged, contemporary political issues.
Right. For example, they look closely at the intersection of abortion access and adoption demand in the U.S. following the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision.
And I want to be entirely unambiguous with you here. In this deep dive, we take absolutely no political sides.
None at all.
We are not advocating for a left-wing perspective nor a right-wing perspective. We are not endorsing any specific political viewpoints regarding reproductive rights.
Our role is strictly to report the factual arguments, the historical data, and the sociological analysis contained within the source material you provided.
Exactly. We are just here to help you understand the broader structural context, entirely independent of partisan politics.
The focus is purely on the mechanics of the system.
Right, examining the financial flows, the legal frameworks, and the psychological environments that sustain this multi-billion-dollar enterprise.
So to understand those financial flows, the sources suggest we actually have to start with the psychological environment.
Yeah, because an industry of this scale, dealing in human lives, it requires an incredibly robust shield against criticism.
They really do.
I spent hours reading through these Reddit threads from the adoption community, and honestly, the cognitive dissonance is jarring.
Oh, I'm sure. What stood out the most?
Well, you have this space dedicated to a supposedly beautiful humanitarian act, yet the pain in these forums is visceral. Adoptees and birth parents are reporting extreme hostility, vitriol, and immediate social ostracization.
And not from outside internet trolls, right?
Exactly. From within their own families and the broader adoption community. The second they try to share a negative experience or express grief, they get shut down.
Yeah, the sociologists in our sources call that compulsory gratitude.
Compulsory gratitude. It seems like the dominant narrative dictates that the adoptee is solely a rescued subject.
Right. Saved from poverty or abuse, and therefore the only socially acceptable emotion they are permitted to express is endless, unconditional thankfulness.
Which is a lot to put on a person.
Oh, absolutely. That social enforcement is the foundational layer of the industry's defense mechanism. When an adoptee steps outside that prescribed narrative.
Like when they express trauma over losing their biological family.
Yes, or point out dysfunction or abuse in their adoptive home. When they do that, they threaten the moral purity of the transaction.
They aren't just met with disagreement, they are treated as ungrateful apostates.
Precisely. And that sociological paper from M@N at Chachement provides a fascinating lens for this by applying Edgar Schein's framework of coercive persuasion.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Schein originally developed these 9 techniques by studying American prisoners of war in Korea in the 1950s, right?
Right. He was analyzing how captors systematically broke down a prisoner's sense of self and manufactured absolute conformity to a new ideology.
I have to pause there, because applying a Korean War POW study to a domestic family structure sounds incredibly extreme.
It does sound extreme, but when you map it out, the behavioral comparisons are chilling.
They really are. I read a story from one Reddit user, an adoptee, who was forced into a closed adoption at age 14. They described sitting at family dinners, entirely forbidden from mentioning their past relatives or their life before the adoption.
Oh, erasure.
Yeah, the adoptive parents insisted on focusing exclusively on the present. Every time the teenager tried to bring up their biological mother, the room would go dead silent, or they would be sent to their room for being disruptive.
That is exactly what Schein describes as a discursive system of constraint. The adoptee quickly learns that survival in this new environment requires the complete amputation of their previous identity.
Wow. And several users actually referenced the BITE model.
Oh, right. Behavior, information, thought, and emotional control.
Yeah, specifically comparing their experiences to toxic corporate cultures or literal cults like the Children of God. They conform because the alternative is complete social and familial excommunication.
And that behavioral mapping aligns perfectly with Schein's findings on sensory and social isolation. Let's look at how the sources apply Schein's first technique, which is reference group affiliation.
Okay, how does that work in this context?
Well, for an infant or child adoptee, the anxiety of social isolation is an existential threat. To reduce that severe anxiety, the child is heavily pressured to align with the normative values of their new reference group.
Meaning the adoptive family and the broader adoption community.
Exactly. And that leads directly into Schein's second technique, role modeling. The industry and the community elevate the true believer.
Oh, the true believer, like the adoptee who publicly praises their adoption.
Yes. The one who performs the rescue narrative flawlessly on social media or in church groups, they're rewarded with immense social validation.
They become the template for the good adoptee.
Right. And conversely, we see Schein's third technique, peer pressure. Support groups, online forums, and even therapists who aren't adoption competent enforce this groupthink.
So dissenters are just pathologized.
Completely.
Yeah.
Their entirely natural psychological grief over losing their biological kin is reframed as a personal psychological failing.
Like an attachment disorder.
Or simply a lack of gratitude.
Which brings us to a phrase that kept appearing in the forums, usually weaponized against these dissenting voices.
Let me guess. The fog.
Yes. Whenever an adoptee tried to articulate their trauma, even among highly progressive, empathetic people who normally center lived experiences, their trauma was dismissed. They were told by adoptive parents that they were just stuck in the fog.
The fog is a fascinating concept. From the sources, it sounds like a survival mechanism.
It does. It's a state of deep denial where the adoptee has so thoroughly internalized this rescue narrative that they deny their own foundational relinquishment trauma.
Just to appease the people who hold power over their lives.
Right. Breaking out of the fog means recognizing the profound loss that preceded their adoption. But the second they try to articulate that awakening, they are hit with what the sources describe as linguistic gaslighting.
Language is the primary tool for maintaining the manufactured narrative here. The sources highlight 2 specific, widely used terms.
Gotcha Day is the first one, right?
Yes, adoptive parents frequently use it to celebrate the annual anniversary of the legal adoption finalization.
But the polling cited in the source material reveals that up to 95% of adult adoptees absolutely despise this term.
95%. That's almost universal rejection.
It really is. And, to an outsider, Gotcha Day sounds like a harmless celebration, maybe a bit cheesy, like a second birthday.
But the linguistic implications are entirely about commodification.
Yes. It sounds like you are snatching a prize at a carnival or closing a real estate deal.
Exactly.
It completely trivializes the fact that for this celebratory Gotcha Day to occur, A profound, permanent, and often traumatic legal and physical severance from a biological family had to happen first.
It centers the joy of the consumer, the adoptive parent, while entirely erasing the trauma of the subject, the child.
Wow, well put. What's the second term?
Forever family. This phrase is ubiquitous in adoption marketing.
I see that everywhere.
But linguistically, it functions to mask the inherent instability of the arrangement. It dishonestly suggests familial bonds are permanent and unbreakable.
When the very existence of the adoptee is living, breathing proof that a first family bond can be broken.
Right. By insisting on the term forever family, the system implicitly demands that the adoptee forget the impermanence of their origins.
Okay, if we look at the stated goals of all these adoption agencies, the social workers, the court systems, they all claim their singular guiding principle is the well-being of the child.
That's the PR line, yes.
But if that is truly the case, I have to ask, why does this community react to an adoptee expressing perfectly natural trauma as if they've committed outright heresy?
It's a great question.
If the goal is the child's health, wouldn't you welcome a discussion about their psychological pain? What exactly is this massive apparatus trying to protect by silencing them?
They are protecting the legitimacy of the institution itself.
Ah.
Think about it. If society at large acknowledges that adoption inherently involves trauma and that biological severance causes lifelong harm.
Which clinical psychologists refer to as genealogical bewilderment, right?
Yes. If society admits that, then the entire moral foundation of the industry begins to fracture.
The industry can no longer market adoption to prospective parents as a harmless, simple, ethical win-win.
They would have to admit it is a transaction born of profound tragedy and loss.
And you cannot maintain a $31 billion highly competitive market if the primary consumers, the adoptive parents paying tens of thousands of dollars, feel ethically compromised about the product they are acquiring.
The demand would plummet.
So, if the industry is protecting a moral foundation that requires absolute silence and the erasure of the child's past, we have to look at where the legal mechanism for that silence actually came from.
Right, because this psychological demand for a blank slate child, a child with no history, no biological ties, no messy past, it didn't just organically develop over time.
No, it was intentionally engineered into the American legal system. The architecture of secrecy that defines modern adoption wasn't built by child welfare advocates or ethicists.
Not at all.
It was pioneered by a woman named Beulah George Tan, widely known as Georgia Tan.
Yes, and the historical accounts of her operations from the 1920s to 1950 are horrific.
She operated the Tennessee Children's Home Society in Memphis.
And the historical consensus, supported by extensive documentation in our sources, is that Tan was not running a charitable orphanage.
Far from it.
She was the architect of an interstate black market human trafficking syndicate.
She would literally be driven around Memphis in a chauffeured limousine, scouting for children. She targeted poor, uneducated mothers, women she openly and disgustingly dehumanized in her writings as breeders and cows.
It's sickening.
She would wait until a vulnerable mother gave birth in a charity ward, and then Tan or her associates would inform the mother that her infant had died shortly after delivery.
And while the mother was grieving a fabricated death, Tan was stealing the child and preparing to sell them.
And her motivations were heavily influenced by the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, right?
Oh, absolutely. Tan explicitly believed that children should be systematically removed from low-type environments, which was her code for impoverished or socially marginalized families.
And placed exclusively with higher-type wealthy families.
Exactly. Over 3 decades, she kidnapped and sold an estimated 5,000 children to affluent families, Hollywood celebrities like Joan Crawford, and powerful politicians in states like New York and California.
5,000 babies. But stealing 5,000 babies creates a massive logistical problem.
Yes, you have thousands of biological parents who might eventually discover their children are alive and come looking for them.
And you have thousands of wealthy, high-status buyers who paid a premium for a child and absolutely do not want the messy, impoverished biological family showing up on their doorstep.
It's like a software engineer discovering a massive vulnerability in a system. Can needed a permanent patch to hide the data.
And that patch was the creation of the amended birth certificate, or the ABC.
The creation of the ABC is arguably one of the most consequential legal manipulations in family law. Tan engineered a state-sanctioned legal fiction.
How exactly did that work?
When an adoption was finalized, the state would issue a new birth certificate. This document legally replaced the names of the biological parents with the names of the adoptive parents.
So it is a government-issued document stating that a child was physically born to their adoptive parents, which is a biological impossibility.
Yes.
It is the equivalent of forcing an infant into the witness protection program without their consent. Your entire past is redacted by the federal government.
But Tan didn't just create the fake document. She had to destroy access to the real one.
Right. Simultaneously, the child's original birth certificate, the OBC, was permanently sealed in state vaults.
It became entirely inaccessible, not just to the biological parents, but to the adoptees themselves, even after they turned 18.
Their true genealogical history, their medical background, their authentic identity was legally erased by the state. And the most terrifying part of this history is that Tan didn't operate in the shadows as a rogue criminal.
No, she operated in broad daylight, heavily protected by systemic institutional corruption.
Tan's operations were shielded by the notorious Memphis political machine run by Mayor E.H. Boss Crump. She enjoyed near total immunity from local law enforcement.
Furthermore, she colluded directly with the judiciary, most notably Judge Camille Kelly of the Shelby County Family Court.
And the forensic historical analysis estimates that roughly 20% of the children Tan kidnapped and sold were funneled to her through Judge Kelly's court,
where Kelly would unlawfully terminate the parental rights of poor families without due process or legal representation.
And the corruption reached far beyond Tennessee. The sources note that in 1935, New York Governor Herbert Lehman signed the specific legislation that codified the permanent sealing of original birth certificates in his state.
And why did the governor of New York care about sealed records?
Because Governor Lehman had personally adopted children through Georgia Tan's trafficking agency.
Wow.
He was a consumer of her product, and he used his executive power to protect his acquisition.
It leads to a staggering conclusion.
Right. Did our modern legal system essentially take a human trafficking model, a model explicitly designed to hide stolen babies and protect wealthy buyers, and decide it was so incredibly efficient that they institutionalize it as standard legal practice across the entire country?
Well, critical adoption study scholars point out that this architecture of erasure was wildly successful.
Because it appealed so deeply to the wealthy consumers of adoption.
Exactly. They desired the illusion of a blank slate biological family, so state legislatures nationwide rapidly codified Tan's methods into permanent law.
And despite Tan's eventual exposure and disgrace, that architecture of secrecy remains deeply entrenched today.
The modern adoption industry still fiercely defends the sealing of records, utilizing the exact same legal mechanisms Tan invented to cover her crimes.
Because Tan proved one very dark, fundamental economic thesis: infants are highly valuable commodities.
And today, that foundational thesis has evolved and scaled into a massive, highly regulated, and immensely profitable legal marketplace.
Let's look at the sheer math of the commodification of children as laid out in the legal reviews. The adoption and child welfare services industry in the United States is currently projected to be a $31.42 billion market.
$31 billion. But it is a market entirely defined by extreme artificial scarcity.
The disparity between supply and demand is the driving engine of the industry's behavior, right?
Yes. The sources cite estimates showing there are up to 1 million families in the United States actively seeking to adopt a child at any given time.
1 million families. But the number of non-relative infant adoptions, the demographic most highly desired by these families, ranges only from roughly 13,000 to 18,000 annually.
You have 1 million motivated, often wealthy buyers, and only 13,000 to 18,000 quote-unquote products available.
When you have that kind of severe structural supply and demand imbalance, basic economics dictates that you get a hyper-competitive, capital-intensive marketplace.
Prospective adoptive parents are routinely paying private agencies, boutique law firms, and unlicensed facilitators anywhere between $30,000 and $60,000 just to secure an infant.
And because it functions as an unregulated free market, it is subject to the most disturbing and grotesque aspects of market pricing, specifically structural racism.
The legal review from the Colorado Law Scholarly Commons highlights an appalling racial pricing disparity.
Agencies will charge up to $50,000 for the adoption of a healthy white infant. But a black infant might be explicitly listed and adopted for as little as $4,000.
It is literally sliding scale pricing based on the race of a human being.
Which is just, it's sickening.
It is. And this economic reality was starkly articulated by legal scholar and former federal judge Richard Posner.
Oh, Posner. Yeah, years ago, he published an economic analysis of adoption that drew massive public outrage.
He explicitly applied the principles of law and economics to the foster and adoption systems, describing children awaiting placement as unsold inventory.
Unsold inventory.
And he publicly debated the free market value of the child. The public was horrified by his clinical, dehumanizing language.
However, the institutional analysis in our sources argues that while the public rejected Posner's vocabulary, the adoption industry itself operates entirely on his underlying economic framework.
They just hide the economics behind the language of charity.
As one veteran adoption industry worker candidly admitted in the source documents, we provide a fabulous service, but at the end of the day, we are a business.
It functions exactly like a ruthless, hyper-competitive real estate market.
You have intense bidding wars among buyers, premium pricing for assets deemed desirable by the market demographic, and steep discount pricing for assets deemed undesirable.
But we aren't talking about waterfront properties or distressed condos. We are talking about human lives. We are talking about literal babies being assigned a dollar value.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This brings us to a phrase that completely validates Posner's economic framing: the domestic supply of infants.
This exact phrase was utilized in the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, quoting a CDC report.
The Colorado Law Review provides a detailed analysis of how, in the post-Dobbs political landscape, there's a concerted rhetorical framing that positions adoption as the perfect substitute for abortion.
The academic analysis points out that the underlying goal of this framing is to increase that very domestic supply of infants to meet the insatiable demand of the 1 million waiting families.
The legal framework is shifting to ensure more children enter the market. But the sociological sources ask the critical follow-up question: who exactly is supplying these infants?
The data indicates that the supply does not generate itself in a vacuum. It is generated through systemic vulnerabilities. Racism, patriarchy, and extreme poverty play fundamental structural roles on the supply side of this market.
The numbers on coercion are staggering. A comprehensive survey of women who relinquished their children to adoption showed that 84% felt they had absolutely no way out financially or socially at the time of relinquishment.
84%. They weren't making a free, empowered choice. They were capitulating to poverty.
Even more disturbingly, 76.3% of these mothers reported experiencing direct coercion from agencies or family members.
And a massive driver of this coercion comes from unlicensed intermediaries, often referred to as baby brokers.
We tend to think of baby brokers as shadowy figures in back alleys, but today they are sophisticated digital marketers.
They use predatory SEO tactics and hyper-targeted social media advertising to zero in on pregnant women in crisis.
Right. If a woman in a low-income zip code searches for how to afford baby formula or eviction notice pregnant, these brokers serve her ads offering to solve all her financial problems if she just hands over the child.
It's incredibly predatory. The exploitative nature of these digital brokers became so egregious that the Federal Trade Commission had to intervene.
Oh yeah, in early 2024, the FTC issued formal warning letters to 31 different adoption intermediaries.
The federal government cited them for deceiving consumers, systematically suppressing negative reviews from birth mothers who regretted their decisions, and engaging in highly exploitative digital marketing practices.
So we have a $31 billion industry. We have 1 million buyers willing to pay up to $60,000 each. And we have a supply side entirely dependent on mothers being too poor to keep their own babies.
That's the reality of the market.
If society were to miraculously cure extreme poverty tomorrow or institute universal basic income and free health care, this entire multi-billion-dollar industry would collapse overnight, wouldn't it?
The financial viability of this market relies entirely on the continuous, unbroken separation of children from biologically intact but socioeconomically disadvantaged families.
Right. To guarantee that supply never dries up, the industry cannot rely on chance, and it certainly cannot rely on charity. It requires organized political power.
To maintain market dominance, you need a massive lobbying apparatus to shape federal and state laws in your favor.
Which brings us to the concept of regulatory capture and the operation of market protectionist syndicates.
The primary focus of the institutional forensic risk assessment in our sources is the NCFA, the National Council for Adoption.
If you just glance at their website or read their press releases, the NCFA sounds like a lovely, neutral, deeply ethical child welfare organization dedicated to finding homes for orphans.
But the forensic analysis strips away that branding. The NCFA was founded in 1980, and its foundational DNA has absolutely nothing to do with transparency and certainly nothing to do with keeping biological families together.
It was born as a direct, highly capitalized reactionary force.
Yes. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the adoptee civil rights movement was gaining significant political traction.
Adult adoptees and biological families were organizing and successfully lobbying both state legislatures and the federal government for access to their sealed original birth certificates.
The momentum was so strong that the federal government actually drafted and proposed a Model State Adoption Act that explicitly included provisions for open records and transparency.
Wait, so the people who were actually adopted, the supposed beneficiaries of this entire system, were demanding to know their own medical histories and identities?
Yes.
And the government was finally starting to agree that they had a civil right to that information.
But the private adoption industry viewed this push for transparency as an existential threat to their business model.
Led by major, historically powerful agencies like the Edna Gladney home in Texas, the industry mobilized its vast wealth to kill the federal bill.
They established the NCFA specifically to protect the sealed records paradigm engineered by Georgia Tann.
Following their formation, they heavily promoted the Uniform Adoption Act, a piece of model legislation that sought to universally seal adoption records for 99 years.
99 years. They wanted to guarantee that an adoptee would be dead before they could ever legally see their own birth certificate.
And they publicly framed this legislation as a noble effort to protect the privacy of birth mothers who might be ashamed of out-of-wedlock pregnancies.
But the forensic analysis shows the true motivation was pure market protection.
Sealing the records shielded agencies from legal liability, prevented historical audits of their potentially coercive practices, and maintained total control over the flow of information in the market.
That was their origin. But how they operate today is a textbook, academic example of regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture occurs when the industry that is supposed to be regulated essentially takes over the very governmental or ethical bodies designed to oversee it.
The source document titled Regulatory Capture breaks down the 2026 governance model of the NCFA, and the conflicts of interest are glaring.
Let's look at their board of directors. The board is completely dominated by the CEOs and executives of the exact same private agencies that directly profit from adoption placement.
You have Kate Trambitskaya, the CEO of Spence Chapin, Mark Melson, the CEO of Gladney, Stephen A. Sunday, the CEO of Forever Bound.
It is the literal equivalent of oil company executives running the Environmental Protection Agency.
Exactly. The people setting the ethical standards and lobbying for national adoption policies are the exact same people whose multi-million-dollar operating budgets rely entirely on maximizing the volume of adoptions they process.
If these CEOs were to advocate for policies that actually kept biological families together, like direct cash assistance to struggling mothers or universal maternal health care, they would be aggressively shrinking their own infant supply chain.
And literally bankrupting their own agencies.
The structural design makes independent, child-centered advocacy functionally impossible.
But the capture extends far beyond a private board of directors. It reaches directly into the highest levels of the federal government through a classic revolving door mechanism.
Right. The sources trace the career trajectory of Ryan Hanlon. In late 2025, Hanlon, who served as the CEO and chief lobbyist for the NCFA, stepped down from his position.
And where did the chief lobbyist for the private adoption industry go? He was appointed as the Associate Commissioner of the U.S. Children's Bureau.
He transitioned seamlessly from being the private industry's top-paid advocate to overseeing the massive federal agency responsible for distributing billions of dollars in foster care funding and establishing national child welfare metrics.
Under his leadership, the Children's Bureau championed initiatives like A Home for Every Child, which utilizes a strict one-to-one placement ratio metric.
The sources refer to this metric as a tool for the surveillance state. It essentially forces state child welfare departments to constantly recruit and license new foster-to-adopt homes, regardless of the actual need, ensuring a steady downstream supply of children for the private agencies that Hanlon used to represent.
The symbiosis between the private lobbying group and the federal government is incredibly deep, especially when you follow the money.
Look at the financial flow detailed in the forensic assessment. In fiscal year 2025, the NCFA received a $324,160 federal grant for a project called the Adoption Sensitive Clinical Care Project, or ASCC.
And who awarded them that grant? The Administration for Children and Families, the exact same federal bureau led by the former NCFA CEO.
Your federal tax dollars are literally funding a private adoption lobbying group.
And the mechanics of the ASCC project are highly controversial.
What's the stated goal?
The stated goal of the grant is to train 10,000 hospital staff members across the country to engage in what they call options counseling for patients facing unplanned pregnancies.
The critical analysis in the sources argues that this program effectively deputizes medical professionals. It transforms the hospital delivery ward, a site that should be dedicated strictly to medical care and patient recovery, into a logistical node for the private adoption market.
Let's visualize how this actually plays out. A vulnerable, often low-income mother has just given birth. She is physically exhausted, hormonally fluctuating, and possibly heavily medicated.
And right there, in her hospital room, an operative trained by a private lobbying group approaches her to offer options counseling about giving away her child.
It places the market directly at the bedside of the supplier at her most physically vulnerable moment.
And the hypocrisy of the federal funding is what really stands out in these sources.
Oh, absolutely.
The government will give an incredibly wealthy adoptive family a massive tax refund, the adoption tax credit, which the NCFA heavily lobbies to protect and expand, to help them offset the $50,000 fee to acquire a child.
But that exact same federal government offers zero equivalent direct cash assistance to help the impoverished biological mother keep that exact same child.
Wait, so the government will give a wealthy family a massive tax refund to acquire a child, but zero to help the bio mom keep the child? Isn't that just state-funded family separation?
From a purely economic standpoint, the adoption tax credit functions as a massive government-funded demand-side subsidy. It effectively subsidizes the exorbitant fees charged by NCFA member agencies by transferring the financial burden to the taxpayer, ensuring that affluent buyers can continue to afford the product.
Concurrently, the NCFA utilizes its political weight to eliminate competition. They successfully lobbied for the ADOPT Act, framing it publicly as a vital measure to protect birth mothers from unlicensed brokers.
They produced a report that directly prompted the FTC to shut down those 31 independent competitors we mentioned earlier.
So they use federal tax subsidies to ensure their wealthy clients can pay their massive agency fees, and they use federal regulatory agencies to crush their cheaper independent competition.
It is vertical integration and ruthless market monopoly disguised as child welfare.
But this capitalization of family separation isn't limited to the private infant market. It is deeply baked into public policy, the foster care system, and stretches across the globe into international law.
To understand the public sector, the sources direct us to a pivotal piece of legislation, the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, or ASFA.
Prior to SFA, the primary overriding mandate of the public child welfare system was family preservation and reunification.
ASFA completely inverted that paradigm. It introduced what legal scholars in the source material refer to as the death penalty of child welfare,
Right.
the 1522-month rule.
This rule legally mandates that state child welfare agencies must automatically file for the termination of parental rights, or TPR, if a child has been in the foster care system for 15 of the last 22 months.
Let's play out a real-world scenario to see how devastating this is. Imagine a mother who loses her job, gets evicted, and falls into severe substance abuse.
Her child is placed in foster care. She enters a rehab program, but there is a wait list. She finally gets clean, starts working 2 minimum wage jobs, and saves up for first and last month's rent on a new apartment.
But the recovery process takes her 18 months. Under ASFA, her extraordinary effort to rebuild her life doesn't matter. The bureaucratic clock ran out at 15 months.
The state permanently, irrevocably severs her legal relationship to her child. She loses them forever simply because recovery took 3 months too long.
And to aggressively enforce this timeline, ASFA attached massive financial bounties. Yes. The federal government literally pays states adoption incentives, cash bonuses ranging from $4,000 to $10,000 for every single adoption they finalize, above a predetermined baseline target.
The state treasury receives a direct cash injection for permanently separating a family and moving a child onto the adoption ledger.
And the funding disparity between destroying a family and saving one is staggering.
The government currently spends roughly $12 on adoption and foster care infrastructures for every $1 it allocates to actual family preservation efforts.
We publicly subsidize the removal of children, while the placement infrastructures remain privately networked and highly profitable.
But even with ASFA accelerating terminations, the domestic supply of infants eventually tightened. So the industry looked outward, creating what legal scholar David Smolin refers to in the sources as the orphanage industrial complex and the horrific practice of child laundering.
International adoption began with a strong humanitarian halo, rescuing orphans displaced by the aftermath of World War II or the Korean War.
But as domestic demand surged, it mutated into a highly lucrative global supply chain.
Child laundering occurs when illicit actors, brokers, or even corrupt government officials kidnap, purchase, or defraud biological parents in developing nations to acquire their children.
They will go to a remote village and tell a mother they are taking her child to a boarding school in the city for an education, promising the child will return, but the child never returns.
Exactly. They take these stolen children and process them through official, albeit corrupt, legal channels.
They falsify birth certificates, alter names, and change birthplaces, effectively turning them into paper orphans.
The international legal system is then used to launder the victims, washing them through legitimate bureaucratic channels so they can be legally exported and sold to wealthy adoptive parents in the global north, who are often entirely unaware of the child's true origins.
The sources highlight a specific, terrifying case study, Lauren Galindo in Cambodia. Over several years, Galindo brokered over 800 adoptions for American families, collecting $9.2 million in fees.
She didn't do this by finding actual orphans. She built a network that bought children from impoverished Cambodian mothers for a few $100s, falsified their identities, and completely erased their histories so they could never be reunified with their real families.
She eventually went to federal prison, but the systemic infrastructure that enabled her, the receiving nations, the massive adoption agencies, the immigration authorities, they operated on what the sources call willful ignorance.
They pretend not to see the blatant criminality because they desperately need the supply to satisfy the domestic demand.
But as we analyze the money and the laws, we must continually return to the human toll. The children who are moved through these systems, whether through the domestic market, the foster care bounties, or international laundering, carry the immense psychological weight of this entire industry.
The sources detail the severe long-term impacts: complex post-traumatic stress disorder, profound identity erasure, and tragically, significantly elevated risks of suicide among adoptees compared to the non-adopted population.
When your entire identity is a state-sanctioned legal fiction, engineered by people like Georgia Tan to protect a buyer's market, the internal psychological pain is immense.
This is why the contemporary adoptee rights movement, heavily featured in these sources, is shifting entirely away from polite reform and moving toward abolitionist frameworks.
They aren't asking for nicer agencies. They are demanding the immediate unsealing of all original birth certificates across all 50 states as a fundamental, non-negotiable civil right.
They are demanding an immediate end to the federal financial bounties attached to SFA.
And most importantly, they want that $31 billion market redirected away from private agencies and into robust social safety nets that keep biological families intact in the first place.
It ultimately comes down to a battle of definitions. The entire legal and financial system is obsessed with what the sources call paper permanence.
Getting a legal decree signed, sealed, and finalized so the child is technically and legally adopted, triggering the tax credits and the agency fees.
But the adoptees themselves are demanding relational permanency.
It sounds like we've built an entire legal and financial infrastructure obsessed with the paperwork of creating a family, even if it means destroying the actual human relationships a child already has.
That distinction is the core contradiction of the entire adoption complex. The industry champions the concept of family creation, but structurally, it operates by incentivizing and capitalizing on family destruction.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's summarize the massive, unsettling journey we've just taken through your source material.
We started by looking at the halo, the hegemonic narrative of pure altruism.
But beneath that halo, we uncovered a psychological environment built on coercive persuasion, where adoptees are trapped in the fog, subjected to linguistic gaslighting, and forced into compulsory gratitude just to survive their family dinners.
We traced the historical roots of this mandated secrecy back to Georgia Tan, a human trafficker who engineered the architecture of erasure, the amended birth certificate, and the sealed records to hide her crimes.
We then followed the financial mechanics, examining a $31 billion market where the demand of 1 million waiting families vastly outstrips the supply of infants, leading to the extreme commodification of children, complete with horrific racial pricing disparities and Richard Posner's economic frameworks.
We exposed the regulatory capture executed by the National Council for Adoption, watching as private industry lobbyists stepped into federal oversight roles to funnel taxpayer subsidies into hospital delivery wards while systematically crushing their competition.
And finally, we looked at how public policy, specifically the 15-22-month rule in SFA, places literal cash bounties on the termination of parental rights, fueling a system that prioritizes speed over rehabilitation, and how that demand stretches internationally to fuel the orphanage industrial complex and the laundering of stolen children.
If there's one overarching insight you take away from this exhaustive analysis, it is the realization that true justice requires the ability to distinguish between what is legally correct according to a state legislature and what is structurally and morally just. Moving forward, I urge you to deeply reevaluate the cultural rescue narratives you consume in everyday media. When you see a movie, read a news story, or hear a politician speak about adoption, ask yourself, who is financially or politically benefiting from this specific narrative, and whose lived experience is being actively silenced to maintain it?
It's about looking past the PR and the halos to see the actual machinery at work. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, something not explicitly detailed in the historical sources, but incredibly relevant today.
Right.
We've spent this entire deep dive unpacking a multi-billion-dollar syndicate that relies fundamentally at its very core on sealed records, altered birth certificates, and the strict control of historical information. It is a massive empire built on a foundation of hidden data.
A literal paper wall.
But what happens to this $31 billion industry in the era of $99 over-the-counter commercial DNA tests?
Oh, wow.
If any 18-year-old adoptee can spit into a plastic tube and instantly connect with second cousins, discovering their true biological surname in an afternoon, will a simple consumer genetics kit do what a century of desperate civil rights lobbying couldn't?
That is a fascinating question.
Will a $99 spit tube accidentally dismantle Georgia Tan's architecture of erasure overnight?
It is a profound technological disruption to a deeply entrenched, historically protected system.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep challenging the dominant narratives, and we'll see you next time.